Alright, let's put the focus mount into the front standard. It's held in with 4 screws. I'm only doing these screws up lightly here. I don't want to be pressing down on the front of the front standard and loading things up too much. But I've collapsed the front standard so it's pushed back into the body. I can do the 4 screws up. Otherwise you run the danger of damaging the shroud where those buttons run up against it. Okay, that looks good. The inner and outer helical, these should have suitable marks across them. 2 on one side, 1 on the other. Yeah, that looks like me. I'm looking at the outer, I can't see the marks. Oh yeah, there's the double mark there. Okay, let's see where this goes. Okay, so I'm out about 2 or 3 positions on the multi-start grid. Went one the wrong way. No, has to move 2 instead of 1. That's better. Okay, so my alignment marks are visible here and here, and they're aligned when the front surfaces are level with each other, which tells me that I've got the alignment there correct. So that's ready to go in. I'll need to put some helical grease in there. So I'll back this most of the way out and put a spot of helical grease at about 5 or 6 places around the outside. Run that in, work it backwards and forwards, check how it feels. That seems fine. Run some around the outside. That's where it's going to sit down into the focus mount. And 2 spots where it runs on the guide rails, where the inner helical runs on the guide rails in the mount. And I can put this in place. Now, drop this into the mount, check that it moves smoothly. Seems to. Here's the retaining ring. I usually run around the inside edge of that. You can see where the 4 fixing screws go, and there's always a bright spot on the retaining ring at that point. That's where the main tension of it was, if you like, and that's where the rub marks are. That goes in there. It only goes in one position. There's a cutout at the top here where it fits, and it's held in place with 4 small countersunk screws. In this case those screws are black, but one of them is hiding somewhere, so I'm going to replace it with a nickel plated screw from my parts. and check that the focus still moves. That's fine. If I collapse the front, I can put my 4 screws through that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. And tighten those 4 screws up. Okay, so that's that part done. Now where's my focus scale ring, because that needs to go back. Here's the focus scale ring. Now I've got my alignment marks that I carefully made here. I've also got the shadows of where the screw heads bit into it previously, which I can centre up as well. So I've got multiple alignment marks, and of course they should all agree with each other. And they appear to, so that's all to the good. I'm not tightening these screws up until I've got them all in place. Then I'll have a final look at the alignment. And tighten those 4 screws. These 4 screws that hold the focus scale ring in place, don't over tighten them. They just need to be nipped up, no more than that. If you tighten them much more than that, all you'll achieve is that you'll distort the outer helical and nothing will run smoothly. That moves nicely. And here's the coupling, the plate from the front of the inner helical, and this coupling arm for our rangefinder. I'm just going to squeeze a bit of grease into the joint of this, because this has been through the cleaner and it's a bit devoid of any lubricant, and this is just a riveted joint here. So let's put a bit of grease on there and force it in. The hydraulic pressure will knock that grease into where it needs to be, and feed this in. Now it's always awkward to get this in. It needs to line up with the slot at the top, the arm on there. If I can see where the arm's gone here, I can just see that lining up there. So I can put that screw in while I've got it there, I think. Yeah, the screw's doing its best to get away. The top of that screw forms the post that pulls the rangefinder forward as you move the focus scale ring towards a close focus position. As you return the focus scale ring to the infinity position, that arm is moving backwards. Tighten those screws, tighten that screw, check the action. That looks good. Put a little bit of synthetic grease in here on that track. As the front of the camera collapses, that arm folds up, tucks away out of the way. Let's collapse this a bit. I need to be putting the other half of that shaft in the gear on the front now. On the 2 big C, this just fits straight down into the front standard. So I put some grease around the outside where it runs in the front standard, a wipe in the middle where it runs over the shaft, and then usually just the barest wipe along the front surface. Alright, so that's in place. I'll pull the front standard up. We have the cover for that gear here, and that's held in place with 2 chrome screws They are chromed brass, they're fairly easily damaged. If you make a mess of one, put the ugly one down here where no one's ever going to see it. Keep the pretty one up here where people can see it. Check that nothing's rubbing on that focus scale ring. Check that the front opens and shuts. That all looks good. Now the front door. To fit the front door, first I'll put a wipe of synthetic grease in that slot top and bottom of the front standard. I'll put a wipe on the inside of those arms. Now these arms may well be bent. I think we decided that, didn't I? Let's see if we can bend that back into shape on the camera. Sometimes you can achieve that quite well. Right, so slip the arms into the track. Swing the door into position. Now the upper pin, typically that's where the thicker washer is. They often have a washer on the top of the door, between the door and the frame. And if there are two washers there, typically it's the thicker washer. So I'll get that pin in place. At the base of the camera, the same deal. And this may have one washer, sometimes it's got two. The idea of the washers is to take any slop out of the door so that it doesn't rattle. It's not as important as on a Retina 1A, 2A camera where the door supports the front standard, but it's still useful. You don't want slop in the door. That seems to be good. I'm checking the door opens and closes nicely. That appears good. It does appear to be tucked in somewhat at this angle. I'm going to hold this firmly between thumb and finger and stretch the door back. Which will straighten those brackets out. That appears to be good. Okay, so far so good. That's the front part of the camera sorted out. The focus mount is done, the door's on. I'm going to think about doing the film advance stuff next. Okay, it's time to carry on with this camera, so I'm going to get some molybdenum paste, run it through here, here and here, on that face there where the spring on the release lever will run, and at the top of the camera through the casting here where the release lever runs, and here where the lock lever runs. Now I'll start with the lock lever. It just drops in the casting here, comes up through the top of the casting at this point. Now if I find its spring, there are two springs that look much the same. It's the one lighter gauge of wire, fewer coils, is the one that we want. And I'm holding that spring compressed with my thumb. And I'll get the circlip in place. Just pop that on there. Press it on with the tail of my tweezers. And check that that moves up and down freely. That appears good. Here is the release lever. The release lever has a spring on the bottom of it, which helps which keeps the release lever engaged with the cam on the bottom of the film advance. I'm just getting that spring back into place, and the release lever passes through the casting here, and I'll guide it through the top of the casting here with my tweezers, making sure I don't get the spring caught on the edge of the body. Now I'm supporting that with my finger from underneath. I'll fit its return spring on the top. That's the heavier of those two that look much the same. And get the screw started. That screw is a bit unusual looking. In this case the slot is not very deep, so that's probably not going to want to engage well with a screwdriver. That's just a manufacturing fault. They're not usually like that. I need to get that screw started. The shaft it's going into there is split at the top so that it grips the screw. Of course, that same function also means that it's very good at being difficult to get started. So I will just adjust the height of that screw until it is just below the height of the shutter release arm here when that's at the top of its stroke. That's probably a good place to start. So that's those two parts in place. The next component I want in is this film advance stuff. So starting with the take-up spool, I'll put its metal bush in the base. Open the back of the camera and drop that into position. My film advance shaft here, I'm going to lubricate this. Pulling this back up, I'm going to lubricate this with some graphite grease. That's the bush that it guides the shaft in the casting at the bottom. And I've found that this is particularly useful here, though you can use any grease you like. I'll just check that that's running in nicely. It is, so I'll just run some into the spring so that the coils of the spring move smoothly over each other as this is twisted. Now I'm taking some synthetic grease and running it over the ratchet teeth here, top and bottom. Check that the spring is engaged with the slot here, that the holes are in line with the holes in the end of the plate, and I should be able to drop this into position. So if I swing my lock lever out of the way, drop this down, rotate it into position, swing my release lever back, I should be able to get this seated down into the take-up spool. Like that. And I've got 3 screws. These screws are the same size as the screws that will hold the trim on the base plate of the camera. These 3 will be the ones that don't have remnants of glue and corrosion on them. If they've been cleaned thoroughly like these ones, you'll be hard pressed to pick which ones you want to use, and of course it makes no difference from a functional point of view. Right, I've got my 3 screws in. I'll tighten those up. I think from memory these screws were loose when we started. Okay, so that's the film advance shaft in from the bottom. And the next thing I want to achieve is to assemble the clutch assembly that goes on the top of the camera. The clutch is there to provide some controlled slippage between the take-up spool and the sprocket, because as the film builds up on the take-up spool, as the diameter increases, therefore the length of film that it wants to pull through with the same motion increases, and as a result you'd end up with pulling the film through faster than the sprocket shaft, and something would have to give. So if they were locked together, you would start tearing the film up. So I'm just going to compress this spring and then put the outer over it, and that's my clutch assembled. I used the graphite grease for doing that. Has proved to work well in this situation. Just rotate that till it engages the slots in the spool. And next thing I need to do is get the bush on the top. This bush, of course, locates the advance shaft. Also has this little gear set on it here, these two little pinions that are linked together, and I've just forced some grease in there, and that can go in on the top. It's usually useful to roll the take-up spool with your thumb while you're putting that in. It helps lead those in. Two screws at the top here. There's a shoulder screw that goes on this side. That shoulder screw, of course, supports the shutter cocking rack. There's a spacer here that goes in, plain side up, countersunk side down. If you mess that up, you'll find that the ratchet doesn't work. Put the ratchet in place, and there's a shouldered screw that holds that ratchet in position. Check that the ratchet pawl is free to move. That looks good. I'll nip those two screws up. I may be coming back to loosen those later. Do them up tight for the moment. The spring for the ratchet pawl goes on that screw, and the spring acts to push the ratchet pawl towards the centre. It's sometimes tricky to get in place. That's it, that's doing its job. Now usually while I'm assembling the rest of the film advance stuff, I find it handy to put my tripod sockets around underneath the film advance here at the base of the camera, because it stops the shaft getting pushed down while I'm working on the top, which becomes annoying very quickly. So this gear goes on here first. So put some grease around the inside of that, underneath it, and a wipe through the centre. I'm just using synthetic grease there. If I rotate this anti-clockwise, it should push the pawl out of the way and engage, fit down into position. Is it going to do it for me? Not today. There we go. It drops down into position. I'm just checking this is in its rest position there, and that looks fine. I usually just have this running fore and aft, that section. The spring that goes on top of that, I usually give that a wipe of synthetic grease, as much to ensure that we don't end up with any corrosion problems as anything else. This piece goes on. This piece that washer. Now that washer's got quite a large hole in the centre, and that's so that this piece on the gear will drop down into that hole. Now the design of that gear and the washer changed over some of the Retina models, but that's what it looks like here. Now I've got to get the screw in place. And because the lock lever is engaged, I can just tighten this up, the shaft won't rotate. And that's my Film Advance shaft all assembled. Start thinking about putting in the sprocket shaft and so forth. So the first thing I want there is the lock lever for the rewind button, and normally I'll put a wipe of molybdenum paste on the tip of that, a rounded tip. Get that loosely in position there, and its return spring and the shouldered screw that holds it. I'll open the window so you can hear that bellbird. Oh, it's shut up now. It would do. Pull that, lift that spring up and behind that tab, like that. So this lever is now sprung loaded, and I can put the sprocket in place. Sprocket, the slotted side goes upwards. The shaft here I will lubricate lightly towards the top, where you can see where it goes through the body casting. You can see the wear marks towards the bottom. Usually I put a bit on the teeth of the gear at the top just for good measure. That slides into the top, pass down through the take-up spool, the sprocket shaft rather. Now if I support it from the top with my finger, pull back that tab, it'll come all the way through. If I rotate the take-up spool slightly, it'll drop down, all the gears are engaged, that's held down in position. And I will put the screw in place. As a screw passes through the sprocket, through the slot of that sprocket shaft there. It's the same size as the ones that formed the hinge pins for the front door. I'll see if I can get this screw started and run in. Sometimes this starts easier on one side of the shaft than the other, presumably because one side's got a countersink that's a little bit more enthusiastic. No, it's starting for us, we're good. That drives, means that the shaft drives the sprocket at that point. The rewind button consists of 3 pieces. We have this return spring, and I'm just lubricating that with some synthetic grease. Here is our button, and here is the washer. Now the washer is important. It screws in on the end of the sprocket shaft. need to make sure that the button presses in, that it's passing through the washer, it's not stuck on the washer, otherwise it won't work. Now I'm holding my thumb on the sprocket shaft, using my special pliers to tighten the button, and you know when you've got it tight enough because your thumb hurts. That's your torque wrench. Okay, so we've got our sprocket shaft and so forth in place there, and we're ready to close up the base of the camera.